The ring sat on the throne room step where Aren had placed it. 18 years of silence led to this single sound, metal against stone, soft as a confession. Every noble in the hall seemed to be holding their breath at once, as though the kingdom itself were waiting to learn what kind of man this boy intended to become. Aren stood before the throne of Edravia, the wolf soul beneath his skin, pulling toward the dais like something ancient recognized its cage. Rowan had just named him the only lawful heir. The nobles waited for the boy to kneel and take the crown back into his hand. Instead, Aren looked at the throne that had condemned his mother without a single witness called, without a single hour of trial. I am not the heir this kingdom lost. I am the son of the woman you chose to throw away. Rowan's jaw tightened. Do you understand what you are giving up? Aren's gaze moved to Selene, standing at the edge of the hall in northern gray, no crown, no chains of office. Nothing but the quiet weight of a woman who had built a country out of snow and refusal. She did not nod. She did not shake her head. She gave him nothing to read, because she had spent 18 years making sure he would never need her permission to choose his own life. I understand. That is why I refuse. Somewhere beneath his ribs, the old wolf-soul bond he shared with his father went still. Not broken, just quiet, the way a held breath goes quiet before it is released. It was the same stillness Aren had felt only once before, the night he first stood close enough to Rowan to feel his wolf recognize the blood between them before either man had said a word. Recognition was not the same as belonging. Aren had learned that distinction the hard way, across 18 years and 2 kingdoms. 18 years earlier, none of this had existed yet. There had only been a young woman carrying a child, a king who chose fear over truth, and a signature that would outlive every apology that came after it. Selene was 4 months pregnant when the first forged letter reached the council chamber. She had already begun reshaping Edravia in small, dangerous ways, opening grain stores to packs the crown had ignored, demanding an inquiry into Omega forced labor, refusing to let the army seize borderland from families too weak to fight back. Queen Mother Merelda watched her daughter-in-law's influence grow and understood. With the clarity of someone who had ruled through fear for 30 years, that an heir born to a woman like this would never be controllable. Merelda did not see herself as a woman hungry for power for its own sake. She believed, with the conviction of someone who had buried a husband and held a fracturing kingdom together with her bare hands, that control was the only thing standing between Edravia and ruin, and that love made rulers soft in exactly the moments they could least afford it. To her, an heir was only worth as much as he could be shaped, and Selene's son was already slipping out of anyone's hands but his mother's. Worse, in Merelda's eyes, was what Selene's reforms implied about everyone the old order had spent generations putting in their place. That Omegas could manage a kingdom's grain, that rogues could be trusted with land, that a council could function without an iron hand crushing every disagreement before it spread. So Merelda built a lie with the precision of an architect. A letter bearing Selene's seal. A leaked map of royal troop movements, a bribed officer willing to swear under oath. A courier reported dead before he could be questioned, an ambush staged to arrive exactly when the forged letter said it would. Selene asked for a trial. She asked to face her accusers, to have the seal examined, to let the law she had sworn loyalty to actually do its work. Merelda told Rowan that hesitation now would be read as weakness, and weakness would mean civil war by spring. Rowan chose to act before he chose to look closer. If you cannot trust me, then trust the law you swore to protect. He signed the exile order anyway. He knew she was carrying his child when he did it. He told himself banishment was mercy, since he had not ordered an execution. Selene watched the ink dry on the parchment that ended her life in Edravia. Beneath her skin, the mate bond that had once felt like warmth now felt like a wound that refused to close. Present, undeniable, and utterly useless against a man who had already decided what kind of king he wanted to be. You did not choose the kingdom over me, you chose fear over the truth. What no one in that chamber knew was that Merelda had already changed the escort route. Quietly, without Rowan's signature, sending Selene's convoy through the deadliest pass in the Frostwild, where a storm death would never need explaining. The escort thinned before the mountains even began. By the second night, half the guards had turned back under orders no one had questioned. The storm that found Selene on the third night was the kind that swallowed whole caravans and left no story behind. She might have become exactly the unmarked grave Merelda intended if a rogue named Tavian Rusk had not been hunting that same ridge for shelter of his own. He found her half buried in snow, one hand still curled protectively over her stomach, and carried her the rest of the way to an abandoned fortress that the maps no longer bothered to name. Inside those walls, she found a different kind of kingdom. Rogues hunted out of their territories, Omegas cast out by packs that called them lesser, families who had lost land to men exactly like the ones Selene had grown up beside. The Frostwild was not empty. It was full of everyone the world had decided not to look at. In that first brutal winter, Selene used the only weapon she had left, the logistics she had learned managing a kingdom's grain stores, to keep these strangers alive. She counted what little food remained and rationed it without favoring anyone by rank. She organized hunting parties from people who had never hunted together before and turned a half-collapsed storeroom into a healer's station. Teaching a soldier with no medical training how to set a broken bone because no one else knew how. Aren was born in the middle of a blizzard. No royal physician, no ceremony. Only Tavian standing guard at the door with a sword across his knees, and Maren feeding the fire that kept mother and child alive. Strangers gave up their own rations so Selene would have milk for son. In the moment her wolf first felt the small, flickering pulse of her newborn's wolf soul brush against her own. Something in her chest settled with a certainty no royal title had ever given her. It was nothing like the bond she shared with Rowan, sharper, smaller, entirely hers, asking nothing of her except to survive. This place would not simply be where she waited for Rowan to call her home. 3 years later, the fortress had become a city called Hearthvale, walls of packed stone replacing the old wooden palisade. Tavian commanded its small army, controlled the gate, distributed what weapons they had, and managed the narrow mountain road that was their only link to trade. Selene trusted him with the weight of a debt she could never fully repay. He had saved her life and her son's when no one else came. Maren, who now ran the grain ledgers, noticed the numbers no longer matched the stores. She laid the discrepancies out for Selene one column at a time, the way she would for the rest of her life. In numbers, never in accusations. A man who controls the gate, the army, the weapons, and the road can starve a city without ever raising a weapon against it. He wouldn't even need to lie. He'd just need to wait. She warned Selene that no single person should ever control the army, the weapons, the gate, and the supply route all at once. Selene confronted Tavian gently, almost apologetically. I'm not accusing you of anything. I just need the gate to answer to more than one name. He reminded her, without raising his voice, that she and Aren would both be dead in a snowbank if not for him. You'd hand a stranger's hands the same keys you won't hand mine? Selene felt the old fear rise, that questioning the man who saved her life would make her no better than the throne that had once doubted her for a forged letter. So she delayed. She told herself trust was the opposite of the world she had escaped. She did not yet understand that trust without accountability was simply a different shape of the same mistake. Merelda's spies found Tavian that same winter and offered him a title no Fortress Council could give. Lord of the North, in exchange for Selene and her son, Tavian said yes. On the night of the winter festival, while half of Hearthvale celebrated in the square, Tavian withdrew the eastern gate guard, sabotaged the fire breaks, and locked the evacuation tunnels from the outside. Edravian soldiers slipped through the gate he had opened for them. He gave the order to take Aren alive. Maren discovered the plan only minutes before the gate fell, too late to stop what had already begun. She would spend years afterward wondering if minutes might have been enough. Hearthvale burned. Selene pulled Aren and dozens of others from the flames, carrying him through a corridor of smoke. Her wolf screaming beneath her skin to run and never look back, while every instinct she had built her life on told her to stay until the last person was out. By morning the dead numbered in the dozens, and the city she had built with her own hands was a field of ash and silence. Tavian escaped in the chaos and resurfaced within the month as Merelda's newly appointed warden of the Northern Marches. Title she handed him not out of trust, but out of convenience. Knowing a man already hated in the north made a useful blade to keep pointed at it. For the next 15 years he attacked trade caravans, burned bridges the Compact had only just rebuilt, and used his old knowledge of the Frostwild's hidden passes to ambush patrols who had once called him a friend. The survivors wanted someone to answer for what had happened. Selene did not give them Tavian's name as a shield. Tavian opened the gate. But I gave him every key. She agreed to a vote on whether she should keep leading them at all. She won by a margin so thin it frightened her more than losing would have. Maren stayed, but she did not forgive easily, and she said so plainly, "You did not betray us, but you gave one man the power to betray all of us, and no one was allowed to question him until it was too late." Maren became the architect of what came next. Together, she and Selene built the Northern Compact, not as a list of rules recited from a podium, but as a structure made visible in everyday life. The gate now answered to 3 separate keys held by the army, the civil council, and the keepers of the grain stores, so that no single hand could ever open it alone. The ledgers stayed open for anyone to read, and Selene herself had to present her own accounts to Maren, and the pack representatives like any other citizen. Emergency powers carried an expiration written into the law itself. If the council did not renew them, they simply ended, with no exceptions made for queens. Every pack that joined the compact swore its oath with a hand pressed to the gate's central post, where the old builders had carved a wolf's mark deep into the stone. A tradition Maren insisted on keeping, so that even an oath sworn in a council hall would carry the weight of something a wolf could feel in its bones. Not just a promise spoken aloud. The years that followed were marked less by dates than by changes you could see. Wooden fences became stone walls. A single storehouse grew into a network of supply depots, reaching every settlement in the compact. The infant, once carried through a blizzard, became a boy old enough to take shifts in the grain stores himself. Learning the weight of the system his mother had built from the ground up. A road that had once been a single icy track, barely wide enough for one cart, became a proper trade route, marked with way stations where travelers from rival packs now shared fires without fear. Tavian, once the architect of those walls, became the name attached to every burned bridge and broken trade route along the northern border. A living reminder of what concentrated power could still cost them, even years later. It was during this stretch of years that Aren first felt the pull he could not name. He had not been handed leadership the way an heir born to a throne might expect it. He worked shifts in the grain stores under Merrin's unforgiving eye. He stood watch at the healer's station, through nights when nothing happened, and nights when everything did. He ran patrols with rogues twice his age who treated him like any other recruit, and stood before the council more than once, defending a proposal that was picked apart and ultimately rejected. He learned slowly that being the queen's son bought him nothing the compact didn't require him to earn. He watched the council argue for half a day while a border pack went hungry waiting for a decision. He watched sound proposals die for lack of votes, watched his own mother questioned and challenged, despite having built an entire nation from nothing. If one person had the authority to decide, those families would already be safe. Selene did not scold him for the thought. She only asked the question that would matter more than he understood at the time. And what happens when that one person is wrong? Aren had no answer. The seed of that hunger, not for luxury, but for speed, for the clean efficiency of one voice deciding instantly, had been planted, and it would not stay dormant forever. In Edravia, the kingdom Selene had left behind was rotting from a wound it refused to name. In the 3rd year, Rowan found inconsistencies in the courier's file. A death certificate signed before the body was found, a route logged that didn't match the ambush site. He sat with the file open on his desk for 3 nights, tracing the same contradiction over and over, and each morning told himself he would raise it with the council by midday. He noticed. He let it go, because Merelda warned him that reopening the case now would fracture the packs and start the war he'd exiled Selene to prevent. It was the second betrayal, quieter than the first, and in some ways worse. Not a single catastrophic choice, but a man choosing comfortable silence when the truth was finally within reach. In the 8th year, a political bride named Edravia arrived to secure an alliance Merelda had engineered. Edravia was never written as anyone's rival. She discovered within months that Merelda intended to control not just the marriage but the pregnancy and the child that would follow. Assigning physicians who reported directly to the Queen Mother rather than to Edravia herself. She used every diplomatic clause available to delay the wedding while she quietly gathered what she could: a copy of a forged seal order, an unexplained payment, an unsigned letter referencing the exile route. The originals stayed locked in an archive only Merelda controlled, and Adria's own family remained under the Queen Mother's watch as quiet leverage against her. A handful of scattered fragments would never survive a royal court loyal to the woman who created them, and Edravia knew it. She could not yet risk what little proof she held. Rowan eventually discovered the surveillance himself and broke the engagement, the first time he had openly defied his mother since the day he signed Selene's exile. He refused to give Merelda another heir to shape in his place. By the 12th year, his grip on the council had weakened enough that Merelda began grooming a young cousin as an alternative claimant, hedging her bet against a son she no longer fully controlled. In the 17th year, Edravia finally smuggled a portion of her evidence to Rowan, enough to confirm what he had refused to investigate 14 years earlier. He read it alone, in the same study where he had once let the courier's file go cold, and understood for the first time the full shape of what his silence had protected. Before he could act on it, Merelda moved first, seizing the grain stores, taking the families of neutral alphas as hostages, placing her cousin on the throne in all but name, and ordering Tavian to march north for the boy, who carried the only bloodline that could still challenge her. Rowan fled the capital and did the one thing his pride had refused to consider for 18 years. He asked for help from the kingdom Selene had built without him. When Rowan reached Hearthvale's gates, he found something he hadn't expected and didn't have a name for yet. Omega sat on the ruling council as equals. A former rogue commanded the northern army. Citizens argued openly with their queen and walked away unpunished. He watched a market trader interrupt a royal procession to demand Selene answer for a delayed grain shipment, and watched her stop, listen, and answer the woman by name before moving on, as though the interruption were simply part of how the kingdom worked. He watched one of Selene's own military proposals voted down by the council, and watched her accept the defeat without raising her voice or her status against it. He realized, slowly and uncomfortably, that she had built a kind of authority that no longer needed fear to survive. Aren met his father for the first time as an adult, and Rowan called him Heir before he had earned the right to call him anything. "I am your son. That does not make me property of your throne." Rowan studied him for a long moment, searching for some resemblance to the boy he'd never been allowed to know, and found instead a young man raised to question kings, including the one standing in front of him. But Aren did not close the door completely. He asked Rowan, almost against his own will, whether a king could reform Edravia from the inside rather than simply replace it. Rowan heard the hunger underneath the question and recognized it, because he had once mistaken speed for strength himself. That night, Rowan sat across from Selene for the first real conversation in 18 years. What was his first word? Selene told him it wasn't mother. It wasn't king. It was Marin's name. The woman who had held Aren through a fever while Selene burned with the same sickness in the next room. What was he afraid of? Who taught him to hunt? When was he hurt for the first time? Did you think you were going to die the night he was born? Selene answered each question without softening it for him. She did not offer comfort he hadn't earned. Somewhere in that exchange, Rowan finally understood that 18 years were not an abstraction he'd been robbed of. They were real days, real fevers, real fear, lived by people who had survived without him. He noticed, too, that whenever he spoke of Aren as his son, the boy's wolf gave the faintest answering pull beneath his own. Not affection, not yet, just the old animal certainty of shared blood, present and undeniable whether either of them wanted it or not. It frightened him more than any council vote ever had, because it meant the bond was real, and real things could still be broken twice. When Rowan asked for the North's support against Merelda, Selene refused to decide alone. She brought his request to the full council, the way she brought every decision of consequence, and let the room argue late into the night about whether Edravia's war was even theirs to bleed for. Marin spoke last, reminding the council that the famine Merelda was already engineering would not stop politely at the southern border. The compact would help only under terms that bound the crown as tightly as it bound her. Selene would be cleared publicly with the original records opened for anyone to examine. The North would be recognized as a sovereign kingdom in its own right. Rowan would surrender any claim to name Aren heir by birthright alone. Northern soldiers would protect civilians only, never seize territory or thrones. Edravia would form a transitional council once the war ended, rather than simply returning to absolute rule. Selene watched him read each term twice before signing, and noted, without saying it aloud, that the man who once signed her exile without reading anything at all would never have paused like this. Rowan agreed to every term. Before the army moved, Marin found Selene alone, checking weapons crates that had already been checked twice. You don't have to prove anything to me by marching first. Selene kept her hands on the crate. I'm not marching for you. I'm marching because I built a system that promised these people protection, and I intend to keep that promise, even when it's Rowan asking. Maren studied her for a long moment, the way she had studied the ledgers years ago, looking for the seam where the numbers stopped matching the truth. Good. That's the only difference between you and her that's ever mattered. It was as close to forgiveness as Maren had ever offered, and Selene understood better than to ask for more than that. Merelda, meanwhile, was already moving toward her final gambit. Burn the grain stores and blame the North for it. Execute the hostage families of the neutral alphas. Send Tavian through the old evacuation tunnels he himself had once mapped to capture Aren as a symbol of her victory. Tavian, sensing that Merelda meant to discard him the moment she no longer needed his knowledge of the northern terrain, reached out to Selene first, offering the location of her hidden supply lines in exchange for amnesty. He sent the offer through a scout, the same way he had once sent word that a storm-stranded woman needed shelter, as if invoking the memory itself might soften her. Selene did not trust him a second time. She brought his offer to the council exactly as the compact required, let 3 separate teams verify what he claimed, captured him the moment he arrived at the agreed meeting point, and used what he knew without ever promising to forgive what he'd done. When he asked her, almost gently, whether the years he had given Hearthvale meant anything at all, she did not look away. They meant everything, until the night you decided they didn't matter as much as a title. Systems mean nothing if exceptions are always made for useful men. It was the clearest proof yet of how far she had come from the woman who once delayed questioning the man who'd saved her life. The Northern Army did not march into Edravia to claim a throne. They secured the grain stores Merelda meant to burn, opened sealed evacuation routes, freed the hostage families, and cut her supply lines, keeping their soldiers strictly separated from civilian streets, demanding no oath of loyalty from a single pack they passed. Maren herself oversaw the grain stores once the soldiers secured them, refusing to let a single sack be requisitioned for the army before the city's own people had eaten. A rule she enforced with the same uncompromising ledger she had once turned against Tavian. It was Tavian's old map of the tunnels beneath the lower district, the same passage he had once used to open Hearthvale's gate, that let Merelda's men slip past the evacuation lines and seize Aren while he was helping carry a child to safety. He had broken from his own escort to go back for her, the kind of instinct his mother had never managed to train out of him, and it cost him exactly the opening Merelda needed. The girl made it to the surface alive. Aren did not. She brought him into the great hall and set the crown before him on a cushion of dark velvet. Your wolf soul already knows this throne, Aren. Royal blood recognizes royal stone. Why fight what your own body has already accepted? She told him that if he accepted it, the war could end within the hour. Rowan would live. Selene would be cleared without further bloodshed. The 2 kingdoms could be joined under one bloodline, and Aren himself would never again have to wait for a council to argue while people suffered. He could simply decide, and it would be done. It was not jewels or thrones that tempted him. It was the promise of speed, the same hunger that had been growing quietly in him since the day he watched a border pack starve while the compact debated. He genuinely considered it. His hand hovered an inch above the crown, close enough that he could feel the old cold of worked silver against his palm without touching it. For one long breath, the boy who had spent his whole life waiting for consensus imagined what it would feel like to never have to wait again. Selene entered the hall, and did not command her son to refuse. You do not have to choose what I want. You only have to understand what this power will ask you to become. At that moment, Adria stepped into the hall, the original ledger clutched against her chest. Having slipped out of the capital days earlier and traveled the same broken roads under the protection of northern scouts, Selene had quietly sent to find her. A gamble Selene had made without knowing if the woman carrying her proof of innocence was even still alive. She was thinner than the portraits painted of her years ago, her travel clothes torn at the hem, but she walked the length of the hall as though she had rehearsed this exact moment through every mile of the journey. Not as a forgotten bride. As the witness history had failed to kill, the ledger confirmed everything Merelda had spent 18 years denying. The forged seal, the rerouted convoy, the payments to Tavian, the hostage families, the engineered famine now threatening to repeat itself. Rowan stepped forward and confirmed his own signature on the original exile order, accepting the responsibility in front of every noble who had once watched him sign it without a trial. But Merelda did not fall because of one speech, or one ledger, or one son's refusal. She lost the grain stores the North had already secured. She lost the hostage families the moment they were freed. She lost the neutral alphas who withdrew their oaths the instant Adria's evidence was read aloud. She lost her own son's silence when Rowan chose to confirm the truth instead of protecting the throne that raised him. And in the same breath that Aren refused the crown, the soldiers still loyal to her finally understood she would have sacrificed every one of them rather than lose her grip on power. Merelda was taken into custody as her last supporters laid down their weapons around her. She did not beg and she did not weep, only watched the hall empty around her with the same cold composure she had ruled with for 30 years. Tavian was held separately to answer for Hearthvale, and for 15 years of raids, no act of last-minute cooperation could undo. He would face his own tribunal months later, in a quieter room with none of the spectacle of Merelda's trial, where the dead of Hearthvale were named one by one before any sentence was passed. It was Selene who stepped forward then, before the hall could splinter into competing claims on what should happen next. The North did not come to choose your ruler. We came to make sure your people survive long enough to choose one themselves. She laid out the terms of a transitional council on the spot, grain distribution under joint oversight, a binding date for Edravia's first open vote on leadership, Northern forces remaining only until the transition was secured and not a day longer. It was the decision that closed the campaign, made by the woman who had spent 18 years building the very system now holding the line. Merelda's trial took weeks, examining every layer of what she had done. The forged evidence, the murdered witness, the deliberately fatal exile route, her control over Adria, the bribes paid to Tavian, the coup itself, the engineered famine, and her final attempt to use Aren as a political symbol. She offered no remorse, only a single unbending defense. Control was never cruelty. It was the only thing that ever kept this kingdom from tearing itself apart. No one in the chamber answered her, because by then the kingdom standing outside the chamber walls had already proven her wrong. Rowan testified against his own mother. My mother created the lie, but I chose to believe it over the woman I claimed to love. Edravia needed someone to steady the transition, and Rowan turned to his son in the Great Hall, in the same place where this had all begun. By blood and law, Aren is the final lawful heir. I place that claim before this council, not as a command, but as a nomination for them to weigh. It was not the crown placed on a cushion with Merelda's hand behind it. It was a provisional nomination, offered to a transitional council that could accept it, question it, or refuse it. The very kind of accountability Selene had spent 18 years building into a system from nothing. Aren looked at the throne his grandmother had used to justify a forged death sentence, he admitted, in front of the same nobles who had once watched his mother's exile signed without protest. That he had genuinely believed he could fix Edravia faster than any council ever would. I used to think the slowest part of my mother's kingdom was its weakness. I understand now it was the only thing keeping it honest. But he understood now that a ruler who can act without restraint can move quickly toward good, and just as quickly toward ruin. No one is fast enough to stop. He declined the nomination. He offered instead to serve as an envoy between the two kingdoms, to support the transitional council as it built a new framework of government, and to stand for leadership only if the people themselves chose to put him forward one day. Rowan accepted his son's answer without trying to overrule it, the clearest evidence yet of how far the man had traveled from the king, who once signed an exile order to avoid an uncomfortable war. Before the hall, Rowan finally asked Selene the question he had been circling for days. "Is there any road left between us?" He did not reach for her hand, and she did not step closer, the distance between them now as deliberate as anything she had built in the north. "There may one day be a road between our kingdoms, but it will never be a road that leads me back to the place where you abandoned me." She did not promise reconciliation. She did not close the door completely either. Rowan would have to keep building whatever came next without any guarantee that forgiveness was waiting at the end of it. Selene signed the treaty recognizing the Northern Kingdom as a sovereign nation in its own right. She signed it not as Rowan's former mate restored to favor, not as the mother of an heir, not as a woman finally pardoned by the throne that wronged her. She signed it as the representative of a country her people had built beside her, year by year, decision by decision. Aren stood with the northern delegation. Rowan stood across from him with Edravia's transitional council. Audria stood near the council benches now, no longer anyone's hidden witness, simply a woman who had outlived the version of the story that tried to erase her. Maren stood at Selene's shoulder, arms crossed. Two banners were raised side by side at equal height, neither above the other. On the day of her exiles, Selene had believed the North was simply somewhere to survive until she could return home. She remembered the woman she had been on that first night in the storm, certain that everything good in her life still belonged to a kingdom that had already thrown her away. That woman could not have imagined a hall like this one, two banners raised as equals. A son who had chosen his own answer, and a country built by hands that had once belonged to no one. Now she understood she had never built a shelter at all. She had built a homeland. The North had never been the place she waited to leave. It was the kingdom she had chosen to stay and build,